I want to introduce you today to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You see, there's 5 major sections in the Old Testament. The Pentateuch, Torah is the other name that's given in the Hebrew Bible for these first 5 books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. After the first 5 books, then we have the historical books of Joshua, Judges, and all the way through Esther, the poetry and wisdom books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and the major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, all the way to Daniel, and then the minor prophets, the smaller books from Hosea to Malachi. The timeline for these stories is pretty easy to follow, except we just don't have specific time frames of when everything started. We call that primeval history. The idea is that we don't have time frame exact for Noah, but it's not really about a date. It's really about a story. It's about God's intervention. With the call of Abraham, things begin to show the people of Israel as a nation, right? And so the people and the call of Abraham, they date to about 1900 BC. Part of that is done through genealogy, because we know that Moses and the people of Israel left Egypt about 1400 BC. So we can kind of create a time frame based on that. We also have specific rulers and archaeological evidence from David and Solomon to kings of Israel around 1000 to 900 BC. And you, again, remember the time frame is going from larger number to smaller numbers. We count down, right, from 1000 to 900. They didn't count like that. That's just the way we're counting it, okay? The fall of Israel came about 722 BC. with specific information with the raising of the temple. And again, in 586 BC, again, the fall of Judah and the people taking off into captivity. And then coming back from captivity and starting to work on restoring the nation of Israel. And about 400 BC to 6 BC, we don't have a biblical record of that time frame. There are books, there's lots of information about that. The people of Israel have stories about the Maccabees, and there's a lot of interesting stories of that time period, but it's not covered in the biblical record. Here's some theological ways of looking at the Old Testament. I like Tim Chester's, people who know God, a land of blessing, a blessing to the nations, a king and a kingdom. There's a lot that goes within that. The overarching theme of a Messiah really is about redemption, that people needed redemption, and God provided them with redemption, a way back to Him, and that they were going to need that way back for the whole world. And that kind of story is what we call the overarching message of the whole Bible. Let's look at the Pentateuch more specifically. The composition or the writing of the Torah is typically considered to be by Moses, but the problem with that is at the end of the story, and in Numbers, Moses dies. So it can't just be Moses wrote all of it himself. There's 4 different sources behind the writings, and we look at this from the word structures that were used, like they used Yahweh for God or Elohim for God, and so we have a Yahweh source, which is the earlier writings, and the Elohis source, or for using the term Elohim, around 700 BC, and then the Deuteronomist source and the priestly source, where you see the laws and the temple practices. And you see those time frames, we can kind of give us an idea of when it was written down. So the story of Abraham wasn't written in 1900 BC. It was written more towards the time frame of the people of Israel, and they're wanting to tell the stories they're being conquered, right? And so part of the story of the Torah comes for helping the people to remember what their life was like back in Israel, and why they followed God. And it tells that story to the people again. Torah means law or instruction in Hebrew. It's the Torah, using the word law is important for the people of Israel. We tend to use a different framework because we see that it covers for us a greater story. The book of Genesis is the story of the heroes or the fathers of Israel. Exodus, the story of deliverance. Leviticus is bringing back the law again and reminding the people of the law. Numbers, the story of how people of Israel kept messing up. They kept failing, and God had to keep on redeeming them. And then Deuteronomy is getting them ready to go into the promised land. And all these stories were told to remind the people of who they are and where they're from. Let's look specifically at the 5 books I think this is common information about the book of Genesis, story of creation. Also the key figures of Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. You're probably familiar with that. And we'll look at one of the passages today. Exodus, the story of the people of Israel being delivered from Egypt and from Pharaoh. It made a great movie out of this. A lot of information about the dramatics of the story, but we also have the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus, and that's an important part of the story as well. Leviticus, not read as much because it's more specific information on how to carry out the work of the temple. We'll look at a specific passage in that today. Numbers, again, this is the story of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and then after Moses dies, of Joshua and Caleb. These themes, the sinfulness of the human heart, the leader God has chosen, the patience of God, is sort of a recurring idea that the people are blessed by God, they sin against God, and then he forgives them and redeems them. Israel kept doing this over and over and over again. Deuteronomy has a lot more information about specific things, and we'll look at the idea behind the book of Deuteronomy, but I want to explain that it's like a treaty, and we use this term suzerainty treaty. Suzerainty treaty is a treaty between someone who's been conquered by someone who's stronger than them. So the treaty is between a winner and a loser. Other treaties are between equals, and you kind of get to that point where you don't want to fight any longer and you want peace. But a suzerainty treaty is in this idea of God and his people, that he is making a covenant or an agreement with us, but not as equals. He is in charge, and we are agreeing to his conditions. So that's how we describe the book of Deuteronomy. I want to look at one of the most important stories in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 22. It's the story of Abraham and Isaac. I want to read it to you. I like reading the Bible out loud. I want to read the whole chapter to you because I think you want to see more of the context. I want to explain all of it to you, but I want to kind of just let you hear the story. Verse 1 of chapter 22 says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham?' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, 'Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship you, and then we will come back to you.' We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. This is one of the most significant and most famous stories in the world. It kind of has a little bit of a a negative impact on some people because they see it as God ordering human sacrifice. But the people of Israel don't see it that way. They see it as a story of obedience, because Abraham knew that God would provide. He was doing what God said, but he knew that whatever was going to happen, that God would provide, that he would not have to kill his son. This obedience, this desire to please God, this is a story told for the people, because he's saying, don't choose your offspring, don't choose your tribe, don't choose your people above me, because we can take and choose anything above God, but so often we choose our siblings or our family because they are right there in front of us. They give us human contact, and we know of their love. And God's saying, I love you more than they do. Obey me. The people of Israel had a hard time staying with the pledge to please God, but when they obeyed, they were blessed by God. And this blessing on the people of Abraham is listed in verse 18 as, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. You'll be as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand of the seashore. You'll take possession of the cities of your enemies. This is what the people needed to hear, but they needed to know why or how would that be accomplished. It's accomplished by obedience. Now, I grew up with animals. I'm kind of familiar with what happens to an animal when it goes to slaughter. But I hadn't really seen animal sacrifice until I moved overseas into a Muslim country, because they have Eid al-Adha where they retell this story, but they tell it differently. They tell the story of God and Ishmael. And when they tell the story, there's not a sacrifice that's provided at the end. It's just the obedience of the faithfulness of Abraham and Ishmael that God's rewarding. And so they see it as, if you're obedient, they tell the story that if you will obey God, you'll submit yourself to God, then he will bless you. And so they take an animal, they buy an animal, and they offer it as a sacrifice, ask for forgiveness of their sins on the death of that animal, and then they cut the throat. And they do this in the streets, in the corner of the street, and in the supermarkets. They do it all over the Muslim world, and experiencing that for the first time was kind of scary. What I was overwhelmed with was the blood, the flowing of the blood from the animal. I want to read from Leviticus 17. This is about eating blood, but it also tells the story about blood. I won't read the whole thing to you, but eating blood forbidden, chapter 17, verse 1 says, the Lord said to Moses, speaking to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites, and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Any Israelite who sacrifices an ox, a lamb, or a goat in the camp or outside of it, instead of bringing it to the entrance to the tent of meeting, to present it as an offering to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, that person shall be considered guilty of bloodshed. They have shed blood and must be cut off from their people. Look at verse 8. Say to them, any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to the Lord must be cut off from the people of Israel. I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. Look at this. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat blood. In this law, or in this explanation of how animal sacrifices are to be done, there's this great truth that comes out in Leviticus 17:11, in that it's the blood that makes atonement for one's life. It takes blood for that blood sacrifice. And you know how they had to handle it specifically. It had to be done at the temple, and there's a specific way of doing that. Well, the story of atonement coming through blood is then found in Jesus in Galatians 3. And I won't read all of this, but I'll get to the verse 10 here. It says, for all who rely on the work, this is Galatians 3, verse 10, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. It is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God. Look at verse 13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Galatians 3 ties together the story that began in Genesis, told again in Leviticus. and it's now real for you and I. This is an important story, the main story of redemption of the Bible.